Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be with you all. For me, it is early morning. I know for you all, it's afternoon. We've got a lot of sunshine here in Washington, D.C. My name is Betty Siegel, and I'm the Director of Accessibility and VSA at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And I am deeply honored to join the summer school, to have been invited, and also to be joined by an incredible panel of people this morning. I'll quickly describe myself. I am a middle-aged white woman with black hair and a white shock of hair that makes me look a little bit like Cruella de Vil. Today I have on red, incredibly sexy glasses, pearl earrings, and a necklace made by my 94-year-old mother. Behind me is a bookcase with a small yellow duck, and to the left of me is a doll holding a ukulele, which I tried to learn during COVID. I'd like to start off really by just introducing the panel very quickly. And I think the best way to do this is to let each of them introduce themselves this morning. And then I'll come back to me and just briefly talk about what our topic is today and roll right into questions with the panel, because we're here to hear what they have to say. Saimi, would you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. This is Saimi, a young Asian woman from Hong Kong. I have slightly wavy dark brown hair to my shoulder. Today, I'm wearing a navy shirt, sitting in my office with a wall in gray behind me. I serve as the manager of the Accessibility Office of the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority in Hong Kong, responsible for matters on inclusion and accessibilities of the cultural district, which is a center for arts and culture, education, entertainment, tourism, and a public space all rolled into one in the heart of Hong Kong. It's my honor to join these sessions today to share and exchange with you all on access to culture for all.
Ruth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, it's good afternoon from me. We're all in different time zones. I'm Ruth Fabi. I used to be known as Ruth Gould up until October 2019 when I remarried and took on a new name. I'm currently living in Conwy in Wales, which is one of the countries within the United Kingdom. My day job is a director of Disability Arts Cymru. My audio description very quickly, I'm a middle-aged white woman with grey and dark hair, pulled back into a bun, and I have a green top on and glasses. Behind me on my screen, I've got two symbols, a logo of Disability Arts Cymru with a work of art in pink next to black letters, and then a very important movement I belong to, We Shall Not Be Removed. I have a purple square logo with that on it, because it's all about not forgetting disabled and deaf people in the arts sector as we go into recovery. Thank you, and it's such an honour to be here and to be asked to speak with this esteemed panel. Thank you.
Padraig, you are up next.
Yes, and I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't muted. So good afternoon from Dublin to everyone. As Ruth said, we're in the afternoon here, both in Wales and in Ireland. And for those of you who are starting your day, good morning, and those of you ending your day, good evening. So I'm Padraig Naughton. I am Executive Director of Arts and Disability Ireland. Arts and ADI is the National Development and Resource Organisation for Arts and Disability in the Republic of Ireland. We describe ourselves as championing the creativity of artists with disabilities and promoting inclusive experiences for audiences with disabilities. All of this we do in partnership with the arts and cultural sector in Ireland. So to my description, well, so as a visually impaired person and somebody who's registered blind myself, I don't have a visual image of myself in my head. In fact, I'd really be hard pressed to recognize myself in a photograph unless I recognized the clothes I was wearing. So for that reason, I asked ADI's audio describer, Breed Nigrugon, to assist me. So here's the description we came up with. I am a middle-aged man with fair complexion and dark blue eyes. My hair is dark brown, graying throughout. It is cut short at the back and sides and a little longer on top, parted to the left with a slight fringe crossing my forehead. I am seated on a dark leather couch with pale cream silk throw cushions with floral patterns on them. I'm wearing a blue dress shirt and silk tie of dark blue with an abstract chrysanthemum pattern in silver. I am told I am soft-spoken with an Irish accent. So that's my description. And I suppose I want to use this opportunity to just before we get into the discussion, because in fact it becomes critical to the discussion, is these visual descriptions. Personally, as a visually impaired blind person, I absolutely hate them. I am not too sure how useful they are to me. I also find them tricky in that I actually don't really see myself. So they're not something I can do without assistance. And that kind of bothers me as well. And they've become really ubiquitous in every conference I've attended in the disability and art space since about 2018. I think the first time I came across them was at an Unlimited conference in the Unicorn in September 2018. And I suppose what bothers me really is we've never had a discussion within the sector as to how useful they are. As a visually impaired person, nobody's ever asked me, do I find them useful? But still everyone wants to do them. And that, I think, cuts to the heart of what we're going to be talking about when it comes to access today, which is the reason for doing access, as noble as it is, has got to be met with that access being useful and actually being inclusive of the people who it's intended for as well. So I'm sure we'll come back to this again, Betty, over the course of our discussion. So I'll hand back to you for now.
Thank you, Porg, for getting us started with a really deep and intense topic that we could spend probably an additional 2 hours talking about. So I did not describe the Kennedy Center to you. I work for the National Performing Arts Center of the United States. Our board is appointed by the President of the United States, and we have between 200 and 400 full-time staff here at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. We conduct more than 2,000 to 3,000 events annually, of which theater is a main source of our events, but we also do dance, and we have a National Symphony, we have the Washington National Opera attached to us. The interesting thing about this panel today is that we're going to be talking about access to culture for all. And when you think about that topic, I want you to think about the intersection between Article 9 of the CRPD, which is accessibility, and Article 30, which is the right to culture. Because this group brings those two sections together in a very seamless and integrated way. The other thing that I want you to think about as we talk is the issue that Porg brought up, which is that all of our work, regardless of who we are or what type of an institution we come from, is person-centered. That the person with the disability is always the one driving, the one steering, and the one helping us as institutions develop fully inclusive experiences, because after all, the experience is for them, for our audiences. So we're bringing the perspective today as both audience members, which we all are, but also more importantly as institutions that fill different roles in our culture. So we've got two cultural institutions. Saimi represents one, I represent the other. You won't hear as much from me. And Ruth and Porg represent the more of the disability services side of things and work with their cultural institutions in their own communities. I want to move really quickly into the conversation by asking the group to think about right now the first question, which is the role of mainstream cultural institutions in supporting or implementing Section 30 of the CRPD, and how the other sections, such as Article 9, affect that work. And I'm going to start with Saimi again.
Thank you, Betty. I always think that it is important to read through the CRPD as a whole instead of like separating articles, because all articles in the CRPD, or basically all human rights, are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated with each other. So I think cultural institutions have a unique role to facilitate the realizations of different rights or needs of people through arts and culture. For example, the right to access to information which will contribute to whether one could be able to receive promotional information, to decide whether they would like to participate in an event, or whether one could have access to interpretation materials or objects labels when they visit a museum, etc. This is also relevant to the right to accessibility, that is Article 9, in facilitating a meaningful participation for people with disabilities. And then the opportunities to bringing people to a cultural venues and being able to engage in the process, and being able to learn specific arts and culture which relates to the right to education, or whether they are able to further develop their own talents or interests into, or even into a career which relates to right to work and employment in arts and cultures. And I think all these are important aspects for everyone, whether living with disability or not, to be able to build up a relationship or to have a sense of belonging with the community, and of feeling being included in the community, like what Article 19 says. So there are many more examples, but I just quote some to show how I think different articles or rights could be interrelated with each other, and all these areas of work are indeed relevant to all cultural institutions. In my experience working in a mainstream cultural institutions in the context of Hong Kong, where accessibility in the mainstream arts have a relatively short history for about 10 years, and also the fact that most cultural institutions are considered as a mainstream arts organizations, which is not specifically or dedicated in promoting disabilities or arts made by artists with disabilities or disability arts that themes around disabilities. So disabilities or artists with disabilities seems to have some distance with us in a traditional sense. And when we need to raise the awareness or mainstream the ideas of accessibility as well as engaging with people with disabilities, we need to take a step back and take a larger picture to see what access to culture means to everyone, regardless of living with or without disabilities. Who are our audience or visitors, and what kind of customer experience and impressions that we would like our audience or visitors to remember, and what are our core values. So when we work in the cultural institutions and we work on our own policy on accessibility, we try to introduce the CRPD in a general sense to raise the awareness of our staff members. And so we incorporated Article 3, the general principles of the CRPD, into our working framework. And then we also highlight some specific articles such as Article 9, accessibility, Article 27, work and employment, and of course, Article 30, access to culture. We try to bring in all these perspectives and that disability and accessibility issues are relevant to everyone, which is not anything extraordinary or additional, because we emphasize that we see exclusion of people with disabilities from meaningful opportunities in cultural life can reinforce internalized oppressions and disconnections from the community, which is widely contrasting with the values of the CRPD. So we don't want this to happen, and so we really emphasize the CRPD to serve as an important tool and guidance for us to review and consider the things we do through a lens of rights and equality of people with disabilities. Yeah, so that's my thoughts on these questions.
Thank you, Saimi. That's a wonderful way to get us started. I really love that you started with the idea that all the articles, the entire CRPD needs to be read holistically as a whole in order to really make it work, that we cannot separate out different articles and still have a truly inclusive approach. Ruth, would you like to next and answer this question?
Thank you. It's really interesting how different parts of the world take on this particular piece of legislation, which I think is absolutely amazing. It's only really been around for 15 years, the whole of the articles. It was passed in 2006. And the UK, by and large, has been on a journey around equality and devising its Disability Discrimination Act to really look at embedding inclusion into the mainstream arts provision for a long time. So I think, honestly, not many people working in the UK are really that bothered about Article 30. And I think that's a real issue, something that we need to be looking at, is why we're not really taking these sort of elements seriously within the UK. Working in Wales, which has got its own funding structure, apart from, because in the UK we have arts councils who are in the different countries. I just started a great journey with them where we are for the first time looking at Article 30 and embedding it into the arts sector. And we've just started the conversations. It was happening sort of in parallel with this conversation starting to happen with the Disability Summer School. Because for me, personally, it was something I got hold of when the whole Convention for People with Disabilities came out, that we need to align to it in the UK. And so I've been fighting every corner I can to get to this place where a government takes it seriously. So I'm really quite delighted that the Arts Council here is looking at really embedding this so that all the arts providers, and we're all arts providers. Sadly, we have all this distinction, mainstream, disability, but actually we're mainstream because we're representing people who are in mainstream life. They may be minoritized in that mainstream life, but they still have a right to participate, which is why I love the Act, because at the heart of it, it's a rights-based act, not just equalities, it's rights-based. We have a right to be in those places. So I want to be able to use the Act not as a kind of carrot over people, but as a tool for people to go, oh, we can really get this right. And so I think understanding how the Act can be rolled into their work from top to bottom, that it's a right space. We have to be present as disabled and deaf people in the boards, making decisions, in the staff, on the stages, behind the scenes, not only as audiences. Because I think one of the big shifts that's happened in the UK is we were very much, and I've been in the arts sector for, disability arts sector for almost 30 years, is the conversation was always about access for the audiences. Now we're having a stronger discussion, and we're seeing more artists performing, getting into the more public arenas, if you like, and not marginalised as we used to be but there's still a long way to go. And by using the legislation that's being presented through the Charter, we can actually give people tools to understand why this is important. And that's why I think it's really strong. And I'm really hoping by the end of this year, Wales will make a big public announcement about how it's endorsing not only Article 30 and Article 9, but also Article 32, which is about the right of disabled people to have international travel and discourse, which we often don't get. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. You know what I heard you say that I think is really powerful, especially because it relates to the United States as well, as the idea that these are international laws, and then many of our countries have our federal or countrywide laws around disability rights. And this is all of these laws are rights-based, meaning our governments, our societies have conferred these rights on all of the members of our society, and that even though people with disabilities may be minoritized, they are members of and a part of the mainstream of our cultures and our societies. Thanks for bringing that issue up. Padraig, you get to be the last person on this question.
Okay, thank you, Betty, and thanks to Ruth and Simon for getting us started with some really great thoughts. So hopefully I can add something to that. I think one of the things, and Simon touched on it, but it was something that Amy Farkas said on the very first recording for the summer school in week 1, which was, she described the CRPD as being transversal, which I think is an amazing word. It was a new word on me, but I love it. And it's that notion that, yes, we can look to Article 30, which is very specific around areas that really interest us, which is the participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure and sport, but that actually Article 30 needs to be read in conjunction with many other articles in the CRPD. And I suppose for me, you know, Article 1, the purpose, which I'll return to, which defines disability, the general principles in Article 3, which Simon spoke about, particularly in relation to discrimination, and Article 8 around awareness raising, particularly when it comes to stereotyping and presentation of image, and the fact that I think our cultural institutions have a big role there. And then, we have other ones like Article 24. Many of our institutions are, particularly the large ones like our museums, are very engaged in education and have a central role there. And therefore, access for people with disabilities through education is really important. And as Simon mentioned, Article 27 around work and employment. However, there are two which I just want to focus on. Article 31 in terms of statistics and data collection. I really think for all institutions, you really need, and if you haven't already, need to decide where you are at now in terms of access. And then you need to monitor that and compare where you're getting to year on year. And we really need that data. Just one interesting thing that I came across in recent years is that in the UK, or in Ireland, Scotland and England, there's been some really good data gathered in terms of accessible performances and types of performance. So captioned, audio description, sign language interpreted performance, relaxed performances. However, interestingly, in Wales, because they have gathered data around the numbers of people with disabilities who attend performances, and it's much harder to find the data around the specific accessible performances. And that's just one instance where it's really useful to be able to get us to monitor and evaluate where we're headed. However, conversely, while we've been gathering the data around accessible performances, we haven't been gathering data around all the people with disabilities that have been attending performances, which they have been doing in Wales. So it's not one is better than the other, but actually it's more about, can we get the data to match up? The other thing which I want to refer to is Article 1, because I think this is absolutely critical, and we use it at Arts and Disability Ireland as our definition of disability. And why I think it's so important is that it defines people with disabilities as persons with disabilities include those who have a long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And I raise that because I think all people with disabilities are rights holders. One of the things that's intrigued me in the activist community is that we always speak about disabled people, when in fact, what I find with many of the audiences we work with, they don't see themselves that way. Many don't even describe themselves as people with disabilities. And I would venture to say that in fact, we are moving further away from the disabled person's language and even beyond the persons with disabilities language. Where we're headed, I'm not too sure, but what I do know is I think within the next decade, we probably won't be using disabled people. If we do, the audience won't understand it. Many of them don't already. And actually, I suspect within a generation, maybe even some of the language within the CRPD around persons with disabilities may not even hold the same relevance. And I think that's really important if we consider that all people with disabilities, whether they identify or not, are rights holders. And if we want to reach them and draw them into the work that we do, it's really important that we reach out to them where they're at. And one of the trends I am noticing, not just in our audiences, but with many of the larger impairment organizations, is many of them are going through a period of changing their names. They're not doing that just to get back on trend, although some of their names might be outdated. They're actually doing it to reach more people. And I know one instance of an organization where of an impairment group, there are 55,000 people identified in this impairment group. I'm not being specific deliberately. That organization, which is the national organization for that impairment group, is reaching about 17,500 people. So that's just, and they are anxious to reach the 55,000. And one of the reasons they're thinking of changing their name is because that particular impairment group are not comfortable with the way they are defined. So just something to add into the mix in terms of the articles that we look to and how we might use them in our work as we go forward.
Thank you, Padraig. I want to, oh, there we go. We've got our captioner back. Ruth. Okay. Want to make sure that we've always got accessibility in mind and covered. Padraig, what I heard you say that was really important was the idea that along with SIME, you agree that you can't read the CRPD in bits. You must read it as an entire document, and that you see definite touch points between Article 1, where we define disability, the articles on education, and the articles on work and employment, because cultural institutions serve all of those roles. We are not only purveyors or presenters of culture, we are employers. We are educators. I'd like to ask the next question, because I think that as you all are listening to this conversation, this panel, I hope that this raises really big issues for you and that I start to see a lot of questions in the question and answer box, which I do want to remind you all to use. Please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll make sure that they get asked of the panel. But this question is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart, because I think it goes to something SIME mentioned, which is the idea of values-based work. It goes to things that Ruth mentioned, which is that we are all a part of the mainstream. And it goes to what Porg was saying, which is more and more people with disabilities are joining the disability community, even if they don't identify as such. They benefit from the types of access that these institutions provide. So do mainstream cultural institutions, does your local museum, your local theater, your local library, do we have as mainstream institutions any kind of obligations, whether they be moral, ethical, or legal, to provide access? And Porg, even though you just spoke, I'm going to ask you to go again and address this question. Do you feel that the mainstream institutions in Ireland and Dublin have a moral, ethical, as well as legal obligation to provide access?
Well, I could answer that question in one word or elaborate. Yes, is the one word. But I do think every institution has a moral and ethical obligation to provide access. The legal obligation varies from country to country, state to state, region to region, whatever construct your country that you're in today may have will vary hugely. And in fact, there's even countries like Ireland where some of the legislation has no legal remedy, but I'll touch on that in a minute because I think it's an interesting point. I actually think if an institution either takes your money in the form of a ticket price, or receives publicly, or is publicly funded, or they have either partly or in full, or does a bit of both, they have a moral and an ethical responsibility to you as a visitor to their institution to make what they do accessible. And I think it's really important that we hold our institutions to that. Now, in certain countries, like in Ireland, and I'm only just speak briefly to our legislation, we've got the Equal Status Act, which does, under its goods and services provisions, mean that there should be access, but of course that's a reasonable accommodation that's provided at a nominal cost. So that's a bit of a movable feast, we all know that. But there are some legal consequences and people can take cases. Then we've the Disability Act, which has no legal remedies and applies to the public service, public institutions and services and local authorities, etc. Probably the one that's interesting me most here in Ireland at the moment is the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Act 2014. And it has built into it a public sector equality and human rights duty. And what I find really interesting about that, again, there's no legal remedy, so you can't go and sue them if they break the law. However, what's really interesting about this is that despite the fact that there are no legal remedy, it's now beginning to make a difference in the arts in an Irish context. And I think that's really good in that our National Human Rights institution, the Equality and Human Rights, Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, they have started to have a dialogue with the Arts Council here in Ireland and local authorities about the fact that they do have obligations to implement this public sector duty, which means that any funding that they provide, does require the recipient of the funding, organizations, venues, museums, galleries, etc., to make what they do accessible. And what we are seeing is this very interesting trickle-down effect where, well, as I say, the law isn't enforceable, we have institutions that are now saying, yes, you have an obligation, and we are seeing big changes coming in policy. And even, Arts and Disability Ireland, as an organisation that's funded by the Arts Council, are now being asked questions about this and been asked to respond to the public sector duty. And so I suppose what I'm saying is that yes, at a minimum, there's a moral duty and an ethical duty. But I think the legal duty varies from country to country and place to place. And sometimes it gets implemented through the law and people taking cases. And in other instances, it gets implemented through the law and policy that gets changed to keep pace with the law, which maybe is a slightly softer option. And it does mean that we don't get compensated for anything that goes wrong, but there you go.
Thank you, Padraig. Saimi, would you like to take on this question of whether your institution or institutions in Hong Kong have a moral, ethical, or legal obligation to be accessible?
Yes, and same to Padraig, I think it's a definite yes for mainstream cultural institutions to have a moral, ethical, and legal obligations to provide access. I think legal obligations is rather basic and straightforward, which usually means we should allow and enable people with disabilities to access to venues, facilities, and services in the cultural institutions. I think no one will disagree with that, that we have such obligations. But as Padraig mentions, different countries or cities have different legal requirements, and depending on such requirements and also the level of understanding and development on accessibility in arts and culture, I think there are sometimes also gaps between the legal obligations and moral or ethical obligations most of the time. Sometimes the gaps might actually affect whether one could participate in arts and culture in an equitable manner. For example, in the case of Hong Kong, we have legal requirements on building codes, and also we have a disability discrimination ordinance to ensure people with disabilities to be protected under these legal obligations. But for example, our disability ordinance is actually drafted in the 1990s. So it hasn't been really updated. So if you just ensure to follow the legal obligations only, we might not be able to offer an equitable experience to people with disabilities because legal requirements are not always as updated as the development of practical standards and also expectations of access of people with disabilities. Apart from building, I think this is also especially the case for media accessibility, which is closely related to the access to information and also the access to arts program, because usually there are no explicit requirements to make those accessibility supports or services as part of the obligations. We don't have any explicit requirements on that. But in my view, I think arts is indeed a very unique and good platform to fostering diversity and inclusion, to cultivate empathy and bringing people together to have collective and shared experiences, and also address issues including sometimes even hard conversations. While we're bringing people to experience a moment together in a theater or in the museums, arts can also serve as a tool of empowerment and advocacy by allowing individuals to express ourselves in our own ways and sharing our own stories, regardless of having or living with disabilities or not, and without judgment from others. However, before true inclusion comes into reality, persons with disabilities are constantly being marginalized by default due to the lack of substantive equality and also accessibility for them to take part in a meaningful manner, either as an audience member, as a learner, as a performer, or just simply a research target for collecting audience data. So such scenarios have to be changed. And I think all these are indeed more from an ethical and moral obligations perspective. So as cultural institutions which believe in the power of arts and culture, I think we should go beyond legal obligations and strive for a more equal and equitable experience for everyone.
Thank you, Saimi. Thank you so much for that. Ruth, how about you?
Yeah, there's a lot I want to say, but it's going to be difficult, but basically I just echo a yes. But I think what's really important is the context within which we're all working, because our legal obligations are all very different. How we, if those of us who are subsidised funded, we will get some very interesting conditions that are attached to that funding, which is very much about access, which is what Padraig was referring to before, when Scotland and Ireland have been able to monitor the actual access that is in place. That's very much come through the arts funded organisations to do that. I'm going to talk from a Wales perspective, even though I spent most of my disability arts work within England, because I think the present context in Wales is very exciting. And I do think it is hit across the whole of the UK, because the values talk, I won't be able to touch on all three of them in any detail, but the values, the reasons why we do things has really become quite a big conversation, with the calling out of such things as the Black Lives Matters movement, and in the UK, the We Shall Not Be Removed, where disabled people have really come together to impact the arts and culture sector right across the UK. In Wales, we really got behind it, and we took over a day of just taking over the social media, saying we will not be removed. When we move into recovery, we want to stay working in the arts, have a presence in the arts. And it's made the conversation really rich with the arts sector, particularly here in Wales. We have weekly meetings to really discuss big issues. And there's a real endorsement to actually work from a values and rights perspective, like I've never really seen before. It's very exciting. It's also, people are making sense of some of the legislation that has been approved in Wales, particularly the Future Generations Act, which was passed in 2014, where they're making some big claims about what will happen in the future. Wales is already a bilingual country with Welsh and English, but by 2026, it aims to be a trilingual country where BSL will be recognised and taught in the schools as standard to everyone. So massive big culture change and culture shift. And I think I love it when we see a values-based organisation start to radically change the way they've always worked, and that the conversation is moving away from the tick box. We've got to do that to include people. We've got to put that for this. It's now, we can be enriched by this community having more access to the art sector. At the same time, though, to be realistic, we're coming out of the most horrendous pandemic that's affected us all across the globe. Our economies have been impacted. In Britain, we're particularly going to feel the force of Brexit and what that's meant. It's losing our position within Europe. And our funding structures may radically change over the next year. So we're getting big claims, big ways of wanting to move forward, but how it's going to work in reality, especially for the arts sector, which has been really badly hit by this pandemic and losing artists and venues closing. But also we don't know what's going to happen in terms of opening. How big can venues be again? Are we going to always work small? So there are big things happening, but the will to change, the will to include, I think is quite exciting. And I just want to make one more point around the values. Our values are expressed by the language we use. And language around disability is so complex and different. But I keep saying context is everything. Know the context of the country you're working with. that we'll be using phrases like disability because we have disability funding from the government for social welfare. So it's used much more openly than in other cultures. So people don't have the same stigma that other people do, though there is still a stigma about it. And we tend to ask this question, do you consider yourself to be a disabled person or living with long-term medical conditions? Because people don't always want to fit into a box. And that's part of the culture we're trying to get away from. One day, will the world be in utopia and we don't have all these labels? I don't think so. But are the labels we use the ones that empower and welcome and actually give a dialogue that makes people feel this is for me? And that's what I want the arts sector to be more and more about for disabled and deaf people. Thank you.
Very powerful statements from all three. I love that the answer in its shortest form from all three of you is yes. It's so nice to get a question where you can all answer very simply, but then the explanations that you each gave for why you believe in the yes is very, very powerful. I do want to remind you all to please put questions in the Q&A boxes. I'm very excited by this conversation. Right before we take a break, though, we're going to give you all a tougher question, which is there a role that cultural institutions such as ours play as cultural rights defenders? So each of you in your own way mentioned the fact that the laws, the CRPD, laws of the countries typically confer these rights on the population of people with disabilities. And the institutions don't have these rights conferred necessarily on them. They are the implementers of other people's rights. So do we have an obligation? What is our role in defending the rights of people with disabilities to have culture and access to culture? Now, I'm just going to put out there that this question fascinates me because I was able to be a part of a group brought together by the Special Rapporteur around cultural rights. And it is a topic that I really had not given much thought to until less than a year ago. And I really personally believe that we absolutely, as cultural institutions, have a role to play when it comes to defending the rights of people with disabilities to access culture. So I'm going to throw out my own bias to begin with and let Ruth discuss her take on this question.
Yeah. It's not just defenders, it's actually champions. Actually, I think that's one of the main things that my role and equivalent colleagues across the country, we go into a place where people don't understand the issues, or they get really scared, or they're very judgmental. When I was able to work out in public domains, because we do it all through the means of live streaming now, which is quite weird, but people would go, oh, here in Lou, oh, we haven't got an interpreter, and they would panic. And it's like, it made me realize we're just not seen as ordinary. But we can't do that on our own. We need to train people and get people to understand why they need to put things out as a human rights issue. It's not just to help disabled people. If you get it right for disabled people, everyone will benefit within your offer or whatever it is that you're doing. It is a culture shift and a culture change. And but I don't know whether it's just me, but defender, I want to see it stronger than that. It's about really championing, really challenging it, calling it out, but always calling it out with the solution. So people don't feel guilty or put off, or that you don't use language to deliberately provoke, which I can do, and I'm a bit naughty at doing at times. But I really do want people to see disability as a human issue. And I do say things like this: people are either disabled or you're not disabled yet. Our lives change, our bodies change, we get older, but we always put an otherness disability. And it's time to really allow the calling out that we saw over the last 12 months to continue on, to get people to start seeing things from a different thing. So everyone will start championing things around disability and inclusion and human rights and intersectionality, because we're so rich as humans, we never fit into one box ever. So it's, yeah, but then again, coming back, different language will mean different things with different cultures. So defender may be a great term in a different place. So that's my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Port, do you want to address this question about the role of cultural institutions as cultural rights defenders, or as Ruth has added to the conversation, cultural rights champions?
Yeah, I again, I would say yes, but I'm very cautious of the term. Champions, I feel slightly more comfortable with. I actually think one thing COVID has taught me is the extent to which on sand access in the cultural sector is still based. And that really concerns me. You know, Ruth was saying she's been around disability arts in the UK for about 30 years. I probably have been around some of the issues of arts and disability in Ireland, and also having worked in the UK several times over the last 25 years, so nearly as long, but not quite. And what shocked me during COVID was the extent to which access disappeared, and when access wasn't an issue. So for example, you know, in an Irish context, we're still waiting to see our first audio described digital performance a year or more after venues went digital. It is going to happen, and it will happen over the summer, but it hasn't happened yet. That's just one instance, but you know, and I also think of the amount of people, really great access professionals who I would have met at the LEAD conference, the Kennedy Center hosts every year, who were made unemployed during COVID. And that concerns me, because that says that the institutions, many of them, haven't fully bought into access yet. And we're still very dependent on individuals. And I do think there are many individuals out there across the world who are human rights defenders, even in this context of cultural access. But some of them are lone operators, or if they retire or are made unemployed, that work may not continue. And so, you know, rather than kind of admiring our own shadows, which are kind of quite transitory, I think we need to focus on embedding access at an institutional level so that everyone gets it. Because I think what COVID showed us is that we're not there yet in terms of everyone getting it and whole institutions buying in. And I think it's a really important point. Just two other quick points which I'll add into that mix is, you know, we talked, Ruth touched on intersectionality, and one of the interesting things that's happened in Ireland is, I think we were very fortunate in an Irish context that our Arts Council had adopted their first human rights, equality and diversity and inclusion policy in 2019. And actually that had a big influence, that when government made more funding available to artists to kind of help them get through the pandemic last year, there was, on the same level, money made available by the Arts Council to artists with disabilities. So artists with disabilities did benefit from the money in the same way as other artists did. But that has also, that policy document has also facilitated a really great discussion around equality, diversity and inclusion that's bringing in, you know, across all 9 grounds in an Irish context of discrimination, which is great because disability is now being considered alongside traveller issues, alongside gender issues, etc. And actually, I think, as Ruth said, and it's so important, is we aren't just a single thing, i.e. a person with a disability. We are intersectional beings in ourselves. And I think it's really important to remember that. And I know I've gone beyond your question, but as I say, I do think we are all cultural rights defenders, but I think we shouldn't stop to think that what we've already achieved is embedded to the point that it's going to stick yet.
Thank you, Porg. I think that's a really valid and important point to make, which is that, like everything, you take 2 steps forward and then you take steps back, and then you take steps forward and you take steps back. And each time you hope that you've made an incremental improvement. But what you really hope is that you don't end up sliding all the way back to square one. I think that you all have, Ruth, you brought up some really important issues around disability being a human issue, and that is an issue of identity. We are not just one person. We don't fit into neat little boxes, and that there is the intersectionality element to disability that weaves its way into everything else. Yes, Porg, I do think that we should be concerned about the fact that institutions that hold up high in good times their accessibility standards and their accessibility work, that in bad times let it go. And that is something to be concerned about. I want to just, before I let Saimi speak, I just want to go back to one thing that Ruth said earlier that I didn't highlight, which is the fact that our values as organizations and institutions, and probably even as communities and cultures, is reflected in our language. And we can get very hung up on the language of disability. Every country has their different way of approaching it, but it is a critical issue to address because it does affect the lens through which we see people. But also, I want to bring up something that you all have not mentioned, which is that values for accessibility can also be reflected in the resources that institutions put towards accessibility. Has the institution resourced it with money, time, and human beings? So I wanted to bring that up. Saimi, I don't want to take your time, so please take your full 5 minutes, and then after Saimi's done, we'll take a break. But do you believe that cultural institutions play a role as cultural rights defenders or champions?
Yes, definitely. Yes, again. And I really like Ruth bring out that the terms champions. And I think it feels like more proactive than just defending something. I think internal and external members, and also either living with disabilities or not, because both people with or without disabilities could be allies and work together in order to champion the rights of access for people with disabilities who might be taking different roles as well, such as our colleagues working in the arts and cultural field, and also as audience members or visitors, as artists or performers, and also in facilitating the development or maintaining specific cultures, for example, deaf culture, and also perhaps we could also consider disability arts that reflects a lived experience of disabilities as a specific culture as well. I think one of the keys for cultural rights defenders is that we should work in accordance with international standards. That means we have certain standards that we should go for, and that might be something we cultural institutions should come together to contribute as a cultural community to give it more explicit requirement or substantive content for it. But meanwhile, I think we already have some sort of guidance through the CRPD, and also sometimes we do have some well-established reference from, in the context of Hong Kong, we do have some established reference from some overseas organizations like the Kennedy Center and also like the Smithsonian's exhibition guidelines. But in order to taking up the role in championing or defending cultural rights, I think cultural institutions is important to equip themselves with relevant knowledge, which means to enable staff to have sufficient knowledge and understanding of the concepts of human rights, of cultural rights and accessibility from a right-based perspective, so that people working in the institutions will be empowered to understanding and upholding important principles and values, such as non-discrimination, equality, accessibilities as they encountered any issues. So they will know how to handle and have a sensible judgment on that through a right-based perspective. Another point I would like to address is how cultural institutions values the contributions of their staff members and also stakeholders, especially people with disabilities, people with lived experience of disabilities. Like for members who are working on championing or defending cultural rights or accessibility, whether living with disabilities or not, I think their professions and expertise should also be recognized and respected, and to be provided with enough support and empowered in order to implement any initiatives in realizing access and inclusion. I think this is extremely important in order to effect changes across the whole institutions. But in reality, this is always difficult. If the profession, especially if the professions is not being recognized and treated equally as other professions. And as in the case of Hong Kong, some practitioners are actually unable to obtain the credentials for recognitions simply because such mechanism didn't exist here. So for audio describers or sign interpreters or access coordinators, sometimes we also wonder if we're being treated equally as other professions or just simply like we're treating as like volunteers. I do think there are some differences, and this is something we should think about, how cultural institutions should make sure that we recognize everyone's expertise too, because these are important facilitators to ensure access. And whenever possible, I think cultural institutions which got funding to support arts projects or programs should also consider provide direct or indirect requirements to support and ensure accessibility and cultural rights. It could be something as simple as putting accessibility as requirements when you grant fundings or to initiate any arts projects, or required some requirement in your venue hires when they rent your venue. I think that's these are some of my thoughts and examples, but I'm sure there are many, many other things that cultural institutions could do.
Thank you, Saimi. All right, this is a lot of meat, a lot to chew on as we go on our break. There are some questions which we'll get to after the break. Please put more in if you have any questions for this amazing panel. And we're going to take a brief 10-minute break now. Thank you all. Feel free to turn off your cameras and take care of your own personal needs.
Hi, you're doing really well, Betty. It's lovely working with you.
It is lovely working with you. You are someone that I've known of for a long time. Your work has always been something I've greatly admired.
I remember a lot of Arts Council people from the Northwest went over to BSA for a festival and things. I was quite jealous I couldn't join them.
Oh.
So, yeah, so I've known about you for a while too. So, yeah. It's a good group. There's only 3 questions so far. I'll be interested.
Right now.
A lot more coming. Yeah.
Right now, I hope that we can stimulate things, but I'm prepared if the audience doesn't ask questions. I've got some more to ask you all.
Oh, right. Have you been digging?
I've been digging through our past notes. I have our notes, and then I've got the questions that Maria shared as well. So we won't run out.
Okay.
I'm sure we won't. Welcome back as people join us. We've still got a minute. It is always delightful to have the opportunities for these conversations. I want to make sure our captioner gets back. There she is.
Yes.
All right. It is 10:13. And we are moving into the last hour of this lovely panel. I was mentioning to Ruth that her work is renowned throughout the world, as is Porg's and Siamese. Really, between the 3 of you all, I think you've got absolutely everyone covered. We're going to ask this last question and then move into the Q&A. For the last question, I'd really like you all to dig deep and think about what is our, meaning as cultural institutions, our perspective on access. What do we think about accessibility as institutions, as purveyors of culture? Do we think we've talked about it being a legal obligation as well as a moral, ethical obligation. We've talked about our role as rights defenders and champions. We've discussed a lot of issues around how our values are actually demonstrably visible to our communities through the ways that we approach accessibility. But what is our perspective on access? Not our country's perspectives, not even the CRPD's perspectives, but as arts and cultural institutions, what is our take on the idea of accessibility? And I'm going to start with Ruth. Oh, wait. Nope, I'm out of order.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to start with Saimi. And we have a couple of other sub questions. So, do we believe we need to have standards? Saimi actually mentioned that without having the set of standards that empower and represent our principles, that we aren't seen as being professionals, that there's no credibility, and because oftentimes there's no credentialing of our work. So Saimi, and have we ever as a community, as a cultural community, had a conversation around the quality of the accessibility that's provided? It gets to this thing that we talk about in the United States about good enough. I provided some form of captioning. For example, on Zoom, we frequently provide AI, the automated artificial intelligence captioning provided. We provide AI. Is that good enough, but is it excellence? Does it represent the level of quality our art represents? And are we doing a disservice to our disability community by settling for good enough in the way that we provide access? Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at this. Saimi, you want to start us off?
Yes, and I think that's interesting questions that there are, there are so many dimensions. I think I'm sure we almost all have certain access standards or legal requirements for venues and facilities to fulfill or to enable people with physical or mobility disability to have access to arts and cultural venues. But still there are gaps and contradictions of those standards versus the practical needs of people with disabilities all the time. In our context, I think those standards are always being considered as outdated by local disability groups, which I also agreed. And so the disability community has sort of a higher standard or higher expectations towards public institutions to be the lead to change, to effect changes. But there are also many challenges and hurdles still. But for the organizations I'm serving at the moment, I do think we do have a unique role in facilitating some changes. For example, because we are actually a cultural district that is still building in progress. So starting from our first venue, all of our venues will have consultation sessions with the disability community. So we present the design and also the accessibility provisions to the disability community so that we could listen to their lived experiences of people with disabilities. And we also have opportunities for the architects, for designers, and also for operations staff to communicate with people with disabilities directly on specific concerns. Even though sometimes in the end, we might not be able to fulfill all the expectations, or either side will need to adjust some of the expectations based on reality or practical concerns. These communication channels are important for everyone to learn and to communicate and to respect each other's. I think this is also an important channel to ensure the voices of people with disabilities are being heard and considered in the process, and for us to know more about the updated standard and that sort of things. We started this practice in 2013 when we had the first design. But during the process, we also need lots of advice from other overseas venues as cultural communities so that we can share and exchange together. And because we all have different level of developments and different expertise or experience. So I think these are some of the international or regional cultural community can work together to set some standards or effect some changes. In the context of Hong Kong, such exchange or consultation process for arts venues was actually quite new or unique at that time. I think the learnings and collaborations between different venues on local, regional, or even international levels are always helpful to facilitate the development from a global perspective. So now we're also able to effect some changes that are beyond legal minimum requirements here. For example, we are adding a room for audio describers to work in the theater, or we are adding quiet room or chill out room or corner at performing arts venues or our museums, or we are also adding adult changing place in some of our newer venues. I think these are all items that are not required in local standards, but we could make them to become our standard, and such best practice might lead to other venues to follow as well. Another challenge and something that might need more discussions are, as you mentioned, the service quality or standard. For example, how do we judge whether it is a good captioning, whether it is a good descriptions, and what would be the right number of accessible performance to be offered? And if you ask me, ideally, I'd like every program and every session to be made accessible so that people with disabilities will have the same number of options to choose from. But in reality, because of the limitations of resources or availability of access service providers, as there are very limited number of people working in the field in our contest, it is not always possible to make every performance or every section accessible. Do we have a standard or benchmark that we could take reference to, or how to strike a balance? These are some of the questions that I've always encountered. But in my work, I do see these as opportunities to communicate with the local disability community and to try to establish our own standard in our contest with reference to some other established overseas standard. And then through communications and engaging with the local people with disability in the process, we can also have buy-in and ensure we are actually on the right path to ensure quantities and also quality of different asset service. These are some of my thoughts, and I'm sure Parik and Ruth will have further thoughts or comments, so I'll stop here.
Excellent, Saimi. You got us off to a very good start. Porg, what about you? What is the cultural community's unique perspective on access? And I know that you are very hot on the quality of access. You started us off today by talking about whether or not our providing audio description of our individual selves when we start these Zoom calls is effective. And so I'm curious on your take around this issue.
Yeah, it's a really big topic, Betty. I do think we have a unique perspective point to deliver. I think the thing we've got to do, though, is deliver it to the best of our ability, and the access has got to be as good as it can be. We've got to continually be searching out for new solutions and other solutions. And sometimes, so what I'm saying is that we do have an opportunity to lead by example. And that to me is really, really important. I do think there is an issue, though, around whether it is the institution's responsibility to provide access, or it is, let's say, a production company who are bringing in a show to provide access, or both. I know in the case of Arts and Disability Ireland, we take the view that all the work we commission must be accessible, and if the artist or the production company can't do that, we will do that, because for our audience and for our values as an organization, that is really, really important. One of the things that does concern me, and I think it brings me back to my first point, though, Betty, around visual descriptions. I don't like to call them audio descriptions because I think it gives audio description a bad name. Are they really useful to me as visually impaired or to others as blind people? I'm not too sure they are, because I'm not too sure how factual people are when they give their own descriptions. That's one thing. But then there is the other issue for me as somebody who's visually impaired, who doesn't actually really recognize myself, is the expectation that I should be able to give a visual description of myself. It does strike me as odd. Now, one of the reasons I took to bring this up today wasn't to pick an argument with the summer school. As I say, this has become ubiquitous across conferences and gatherings, in certainly anything I've attended in the arts and disability or disability arts sphere over the last 2-3 years. But one of the things that has troubled me more than even the whether visual descriptions are a good thing or a bad thing is there's been no discussion. And it's one of the really tricky things that we don't discuss whether the access is working or not. There seems to be a feeling that if we provide the access, then it works, and that people are going to use it. And that isn't necessarily the case. And I think we really need to challenge ourselves. In fact, I think when in our pre-discussion, Betty, we talked about, I was talking about the fact that I thought every organization should have, you know, the two characters from the Muppets, and I had to go and look up their names. So Statler and Waldorf, and these were two guys who sat in the box at the side of each show of the Muppets, and they talked about how awful the production was. And I actually think there needs to be a lot more time and energy giving to questioning the access we're providing, working out is it the best thing, checking where it's falling down and fixing it, and continually improving the service, but not seeing it as something that's static, not seeing it as something that we're doing perfectly, because there is always room for improvement. And I think that's absolutely key. Like, for example, I'll just give you one or two examples. I remember wanting to see a new Wi-Fi audio description delivery system, and I went to see a show that was audio described using this Wi-Fi system. And although this show had been on tour for the best part of 3 months, I was told I was the first audience member who objected to it, because what happened was the audio describer was on stage. Now, one of the things with Wi-Fi is there's a time lag of several seconds, which basically meant that I was getting an echo of all the actors' voices out of sync with what was going on stage, because that was being picked up by the audio describer's microphone, who was also an actor on stage. And that's a technical issue, and somebody should be able to solve that, and it shouldn't take an audience member to point it out. And so I think that's when I get really bothered by standards, is that we need to be all the time checking our own standards. Do we live up to our own expectations? You know, I know from seeing show reports at some of the venues we worked at, that if mobile, they will take note of how many mobile phones go off. Well, they should equally be working and checking, is the access working on the particular night? Are there batteries in the audio description receivers? You know, there are a whole myriad of things that we need to be continually questioning. And you know, I think when it comes to standards, and Simon touched on it really eloquently, you know, our clearest standards are around the building regulations. But for example, we've seen ourselves during COVID that in fact, you know, as work has moved digital, even the way captioning is provided has varied hugely. Like, there's captioning being provided like subtitles, which has no audio information in captions for a deaf audience to actually understand. In you know, locally here, we've had no audio described performances yet. So there are really big issues. The other thing is a lot of providers have started, you know, mixing and matching and putting equipment and software and hardware together, but actually not testing to make sure that it is fully accessible. And so there are, I think, really big challenges. And I also agree with Simon that we should figure ways of working internationally to try and build standards, whether it's standards around audio description, around captioning either in theatre or on or digitally, etc. It's really I think really key. So I'll hand back to you with that for now, because we'll probably get more questions after.
Sure. We've got, if you can check in the Q&A box, we do have 6 questions that are open. I want to throw this over to Ruth Ruth, I think you were the one that talked when we originally chatted as a panel about how inconsistent things are and in a way that people are making things up as they go along.
Yeah, I'm going to talk from my experience, really, not from an organisation, but just the journey I've been on as someone who's been a hearing aid wearer since I was 6. I was sort of written off. My first experience of getting into the arts was just winging it because I never had any access. I tried to get to pass some drama exams and was told constantly, you don't sound right. There's a deadening to your voice. It's just typical when you're deaf. And so I wasn't getting past. And that culture back in the early 80s was so offensive. So when I discovered, first of all, the social model and the disability voice, it changed how I perceived myself. And I realized it was a right to have access into things. So my 30-year journey plus has been very much about how access has not only impacted me, but also what we tried to do with setting up DataFest in 2001, because the building regs, I think we all kind of chime that has happened, and level access and accessible loos and things like this are kind of happening now. But when it comes to the other side of access, the inconsistencies are really tough, mostly because it's an add-on, an afterthought. It's not embedded into the start of the arts process. But it's also what we do around access. I never will use the term fully accessible because I don't believe you can be fully accessible, because there's an arrogance saying that, because you're trying to encourage people who've not been able to engage to tell you their access requirements so you can start to make them welcoming to whatever your arts offer is. There's a whole raft of how access needs have to be thought through. We do have standards trying to be set with things, definitely with sign language, you know, only use qualified sign language, use qualified lip speakers, use qualified captioners, so you are getting the standard of service. But often because of funding, people will just make do, which gives disabled and deaf people a very inferior service. And we can't afford to do that anymore. People need to get equality of service, equity of service across the board. So we need to train people to provide. I think I started all this work before we had the digital revelation. And some of the things we had to deal with back then have been eliminated through what digital technology has allowed us to be able to achieve around access. But we're not making the most of it. And we're not teaching people who are in the arts sector, whether they're technicians, front of house, performers, lighting technicians, to actually embed the thinking of this access for disabled people and to make it the norm, not the add-on. It's a big area for me, because it's like I do a lot of disability equality training, and a lot of it is around access to the arts and how they understand access barriers. But we are such a diverse and amazing group of people. We all have very different access needs, and some of them conflict. And so we need to develop policies and practices that can be more inclusive and open and welcoming. DataFest was about culture change when it started, get disabled people into the places we're not, of NATMA as the mainstream venues as they are back then, and we were just not being seen there, and help them understand why they needed to change and become more accessible. But the other side of it is the training, the standards. It's not, there's so much of the add-on happening. It's really looking at work around creative aesthetics. You know, one of the great projects that we were doing last year was working with an audio describer who was a blind person herself, who's trained in this, working with our visual artists to get them to audio describe their work. And practically all of them were saying, we've never thought about how people look at our work, we just do it. And I think it's about getting artists to think differently, directors and other people, to start to see this as the creative way to be. It's exciting. You can take people into a very different journey that isn't boring or infantile, which sometimes work can be, but we can start to look creatively around access and make it an exciting part and make people start to see, yeah, there's disabled people all over the place. You know, not just when we're doing a disability event, but we're actually starting to think of it not just for 2 or 3 shows in a run, but all the time, by thinking back to the inception and the thinking, working with set designers and everything. So yeah, it's a big area, but I think disabled people, those of us with lived experience, those of us who trained in the arts, can help with answers here, and it's engaging with us to get those answers. And we need to really look at the variety of disabled people that we're engaging with. So we're not always going with the people who are graduates and have got certain skills, but we actually know that there is a democracy around arts and engagements in the arts that we need to address as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Now, we have talked so much on this panel and had so many amazing thoughts that we're going to have a very short time for questions. And I know, for example, that Ruth has to jump off almost immediately at the end of this hour. So I'm going to try to consolidate some of these questions, but quickly, I want to just point out a few things that the panelists just said that resonated with me. The idea that as an international community, we have an opportunity to develop a set of standards, but that, as Porg pointed out, we want to make sure those standards are reaching a very high bar. You mentioned that there's the working, which is a pretty low bar. I use the term effective, which is a legal term under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is also a fairly low bar. Is it effective or not? It doesn't ask if it's good or not, quality or not. And then the other thing is whether it's good enough for our level of arts participation. Ruth, you brought up just now the idea that you never say fully accessible. At the Kennedy Center, we say we strive for accessibility, leaving open the idea that it is an ongoing, constant effort to be accessible and that we never actually reach full accessibility because, as Porg and Simon pointed out, things are changing constantly and access is never static. So going to the audience here, I think that embedded in some of these questions is the question that maybe you all can answer, which is what types of practices have you three seen that are either new that you were impressed by or that helped to support and influence the participation of people with disabilities, such as access writers is a relatively new thing we've been seeing. What's something new, innovative, improved that you're seeing is going on that makes access to cultural experiences more available?
Can I come in there, Betty?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So 2 things. One of the, in fact, both relate to LEAD, but one of them was that, you know, the first time I ever had a sighted guide was offered to me at a LEAD conference. And, you know, it wasn't necessarily for the sessions I attended that I really needed the sighted guide, but it was to find the speakers afterwards because I couldn't see them well enough. It was to figure out what sandwiches were what at lunchtime. These all sound like quite basic things, but actually, otherwise you just take a little bit of everything and hope you like some of it. And in the case of not being able to recognize people, you just don't find them. And so having a sighted guide for me at a conference where there are maybe 600 people was an absolute revelation, and I really enjoyed. Another thing happened to me at LEAD was we came across these devices called Discovery pens, which are they're like stubby little pens that are MP3 players, and you can basically set up codes like QR codes that are beside an artwork or an installation. And then when you touch the pen off the code, you can have an audio description play to you. Now, what's interesting about that, it was great in that it allows the user to go from artwork to artwork, but if they're not interested in an artwork, they can skip. They don't have to start at work 1 and work through to work 20. In fact, they could start any place in the exhibition and find information about the particular work. One of the interesting things, and this is where access can come unstuck sometimes, it was a great solution. Loads of visually impaired and blind people found it useful. And we started to add artists' voices as well. So a lot of the public found it useful. So it was great. However, the way the visual arts works in a lot of countries, including Ireland, is that the shows get installed right up until the last minute. Very often the paint is drying as the people are coming into the private view. And what we found was that we just couldn't get the audio descriptions in place on time to go on the pens. So we had to move to a system where we train individual members of staff, educators, curators, and invigilators, so they can actually deliver the audio description live. So it was a case of that we couldn't get the practice in terms of the way exhibitions were installed to change sufficiently to make that access work. So we had to rethink it completely.
Great. Saimi or Ruth, Saimi, would you like to, do you have an idea of something that's new or innovative or improved?
Yes, I think it's about captioning, and I experienced the smart glasses at the National Theatre in London, and that they have when they do the performances, and I wear the glasses. There are different options for me to like choose the color, the font size of the caption that will appear in the glasses. So other audience will not see the caption, but then when I wear the glasses, I can see the captioning, which is very helpful for me actually, because English is my second language. And when I enjoy the performance as a tourist, I think that's actually, I especially chose that performance so that I can have better understanding of what's going on the stage. And also like at the moment, I actually reading the stream text at the same time, because it actually helps me to follow the conversation better. But because I'm always impressed by all these captioning things, because live captioning things, because in the case of Hong Kong, when we speak Cantonese, we're actually still finding solutions that we could transcribe Cantonese into live Chinese, so that to facilitate live captionings for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, we're still finding ways to solve this. So I'm always impressed by any solutions with captioning. Yeah.
Wonderful.
I'm going to relate back to it's the artist taking lead on making work that can come from an exciting creative places. And the week we had to go into lockdown, I saw my last live performance, and it was by an incredible writer that Porrig knows well, Kate O'Reilly. It was called A Beauty Parade, and it was about the story of women who went underground in France and sent war messages back during the war, and they're often they were forgotten and not given a voice. But what Kate did is she worked with 3 actors and technologists, creative technologists, to make the most incredibly aesthetic and audio experience. One of the lead actresses is deaf and used visual expression. So she was gesturing and showing it wasn't just pure sign, it was more than that. She was showing what she was going through in terms of torture, and on the screen there was not just a captioning, but there was sense of the scene coming alive, but again there was audio description spoken as part of the dialogue. And it took them a long time of research and development to get to that sort of level. But the actual event was so welcome to anybody and everybody. It wasn't access just for disabled people or deaf people. It was there for everyone to enjoy and embrace and be really just moved by. And I'd like to see more practice of that, more funding put in to that sort of work. But Kate is pioneering in this and written quite a few books, but it's trying to get it into the training places where it becomes normal and not just artists once they've achieved suddenly go, I'd like to do some of this, but let it be ingrained, bring it in earlier.
Fabulous. How can the cultural institutions that we represent and others like us play a role in ensuring that the gains that we've made in access and inclusion and civil and human rights for people with disabilities are given adequate attention or brought to the attention of those people in our communities who may be a little less aware or a little less woke, as we might say, around the issues? And this may be one of our last questions, because I know it's a really deep one, but what is the role of cultural institutions?
I think country institutions have got a responsibility to really reflect their communities, and all too often disabled people are not part of the board right the way down an organisation. We are very much in society, but you wouldn't think it, especially when you start to look at leadership hierarchies, how many disabled people are actually directing or calling the shots. We need to actually fundamentally change and challenge and call out the systemic ableism that is in our societies, where disabled people don't get the same chances and are always having to play catch up. And so they've got responsibility to really reflect their communities.
That's a great answer, Ruth. Saimi or Padraig?
Saimi, do you want to go next?
Yes, I think for us, I do think reaching out to the community is important. Reaching out to people with disabilities and also other general audience to show that, to promote what we are doing. I also got some challenge sometimes that some people may think that, oh, that's accessible performance, so you just go to promote it to the people with visual impairment or people who are deaf or hard of hearing. But then also keep reminding that we actually should promote it to the general public, because we never know whether there are someone out there who might not aware of this access, and that might be one day they just read some general pamphlets or leaflet, and then they notice that, oh, this icon is interesting, what's that about? And then they try to look that out. I think it is always important that we need to mainstream everything we do into the mainstream items. Yeah.
So what I would, just picking up on one or 2 points there from Saimi, which I think is important, is I think we need to, as Saimi said, we need to focus on getting on mainstreaming what we do, because in fact it goes back to my very first point around Article 1 and who people with disabilities are, and many of them don't identify as disabled people. Some of them don't even identify with their impairment in a public way. However, they are all rights holders, and they very often will identify with the fact that they need access. And I know something we do at Arts and Disability Ireland, we've long stopped saying who the access service is for and what the access service does. So, audio description isn't for blind people. It's a visual description of what's happening on stage. And so it's whoever needs that visual description can use audio description. And I only pick that as one example. And I think the other thing which I would say is that I totally agree with Ruth around creativity and that we can be more creative around access. but I think at a minimum, we've always got to get the access right. So in other words, the access has got to work for the audience member who comes to that show or goes to that exhibition. And it's all very well for artists to be creative. You know, we've all come across the designers who will put print on top of photographs. The truth is, theatre practitioners are well capable of doing the equivalent, and we need to be really careful about that, because, you know, I just one example, I've been to a show myself, which was a dance show, and the dancer decided they were going to audio describe, and it was a bit like being part of her workout by the end. It was just a lot of huffing and puffing and panting, and the audio description was totally out of sync. So I shall leave that with you as a thought and an image.
That is a real image to leave us with, Porg. We have just 8 minutes here, and so I want to ask a question that maybe might get a little under our collars a bit. And I'm sort of synopsizing what some other people have asked, but what would happen if, as cultural institutions, we refused to host or allow artists or performers or producers or presenters to use our venues for their work if it's not accessible? Should we be in there policing that? Should we be in there in solidarity and allyship with the disability community by making that a requirement, a mandate?
It's a difficult one, that, because you have to know what standards you're measuring against, because everyone has their own understanding of what they mean by access. There are organisations in the UK, and I love the name of this because this is very much what it's about. Attitude is everything. And that really underpins everything about what we do. It's an attitude to be inclusive, to be accessible, to be able to put on work that really reflects the communities we serve. But they do it around music, and they do a lot of training, and they go to the gigs, and they really challenge, and they've helped venues become more understanding and accessible within the music sector. So we need that level of knowledge for the different sectors, but I do think we can drive it from the artists as well and get it to be felt exciting to be doing work that it is actually embedding access into everything. So it's not just 2 or 3 signed performances or whatever, that it's actually embedded more. And I think we need to help people take those risks with knowledge and understanding and support them. It's one of the great things we're able to do in Wales, getting alongside arts venues who really want to get it right, knowing that we probably won't, but we're working to do it, because there's always things we can do more anyway.
Thank you, Ruth. Saimi or Porg, what do you think? Should we be taking a stance as cultural institutions that if something's not accessible, we aren't going to present it?
Yeah, I think we should, and I think it's really important. I know at Arts and Disability Ireland, as I said earlier, we don't commission something that isn't accessible, and if it's not going to be made accessible by the artist, we hold on to some of the budget and we make it accessible. That's the way we work, and it's a condition. I do know of one German venue, whose name I can't remember because just not on the top of my tongue, who basically have gone dark for one portion of their year. They can afford out of their current budgets to audio describe every show that they do. And I think that's a very public statement. One thing though I am reminded of, Betty, was a few years ago we were working on a Beckett show. Won't it say the company or the venue, just say it was a Beckett show, and we got a call about 3 days before the show was to be audio described from the company saying, would you audio describe while the actors are speaking, because the silences are more important in Beckett? And we said, no, but we will charge you because we've already done all the development work. So you decide whether you will pay the charges for us not doing the show, or you let us audio describe the way we should, which is we will describe in between where the actors are speaking so that the blind audience can actually understand what's going on. But that was one of my most ridiculous requests that I've ever had from a company.
That came from the company, not from a person with a disability.
Oh, it came from the company. Yeah, because the silences are very important in Beckett, you know.
Again, it goes to Simon's point that we have got to listen to and hear our disability community, and that we need to put them together with the architects and the operations people and the artistic people at our venues so that they can really understand the perspective. Simon, what do you think?
I personally think that it is a definite yes that we should have a stand, but then in reality, it is also, there are lots of pushback, I would say. But I think if we do not make it a mandate, perhaps sometimes we could try to put out some incentives for people to attract people to try to offer. For example, if we have a scoring system, maybe if someone, they will provide access and then there are a certain percentage of scoring that is contributed to access, then perhaps this could be some incentives that we could try to attract people to have access when they rent our venues. So because of time, so I think I'll stop here.
We do have 3 minutes. I'll answer for the commissioner on this one at least. I hope that in the United States, and especially in Washington, D.C., where we are based, that our disability community does see us as allies. And we try to embed accessibility into our work and our practices. And we do have every entity or individual signs before they perform or present or do anything at the Kennedy Center that they will abide by two things. One is federal law to not discriminate against people with disabilities. That is a contractual obligation they take on. And two, that not only will they comply with federal law, but they will comply with the Kennedy Center's policies that implement federal law in how we present and believe in access for all at all performances all the time. And so that's just one example. I thought Porgs was really interesting. They actually hold out money and say, wow, if you're not going to do it, then we're going to do it for you with your dollars. And these are really important issues. There are 2 minutes left. I know that Ruth has to run immediately, so I'm just going to ask each of the three of you. I didn't ask you to do this before, but if you had 1 or 2 sentences that you wanted to share, 1 or 2 thoughts that you wanted to share with this audience before we close out today, I want to give you a chance to do that. So Ruth, do you have 1 or 2 things?
Yeah, I really want to bring access and understanding earlier in disabled young people's lives. They get really bad access, particularly audio description, if they get it at all. And we've got to make it's the ordinary. It's not an add-on. It never will be.
Thank you. Simon, do you have 1 thought?
Yes. I think access to arts and culture is not just simply for leisure and recreations. It's about equality and social justice, and that interrelated with many other human rights. So we should respect, promote, and protect it. Every individual, regardless of living with disabilities or not, could be cultural-wise champions. So we just try to find out the uniqueness of our own role and positions and just do it.
Thank you. Porg, we'll leave you to wrap us up here today. What are your last 2 or 3 thoughts?
Okay, thank you, Betty. I think the key thing is we need to continue to share. You know, I remember when you came to speak in Galway in 2016 at Creative Connections, Betty, somebody asked you, what do we do next? And you said, talk to each other. And I think that is really key. Everybody who is part of this conversation today is invested in culture and access, and you can do something, you can make a difference. And I think within institutions, a key thing is everyone needs to be involved, not just the access officer, but everyone needs to be an access champion, and everyone needs to understand how the access works within that institution. And if you see issues, there needs to be ways of reporting it back so they can get fixed. But the key thing is that we're all sharing and in dialogue with each other continually.
Thank you, Porg. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Ruth. I know you need to run. And thank you to the participants who've listened to this discussion today. And thank you to the Galway School for inviting us all here. Enjoy your mornings, afternoons, and evenings. And we're going to sign off at this point, I believe. Thank you all.
Thank you. Brilliant chairing, Betty. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.